I'm Tim Cromartie, the lobbyist for public safety issues, and today we will be discussing the League's draft recommendations for advocacy. These recommendations are subject to review and approval by our policy committees, namely public safety and transportation, communication, and public works. We will be vetting those recommendations, which we're about to share with you at those policy committees this coming January. But we wanted to share with our members our thought process and what the recommendations that we're working on at the moment. These are subject, obviously, to more discussion, to input from our members. They represent a mixture of input from relevant state agencies, first responders, and the League's own comment letter, which was submitted to the U.S. Department of Justice in late September. Again, your input on these draft recommendations is welcome. This webinar will be more interactive than previous webinars because we will open the phone lines during the Q&A period to not only be able to field questions, but to have a little back and forth discussion to the degree there's an interest in that. These recommendations are intended, at the end of the day, to help guide local government efforts to lobby for appropriate changes at the federal level regarding rail safety and emergency preparedness. So to review how to ask a question, all phone lines again will be muted until the Q&A or discussion period. For questions, use the Q&A window on the right side of your screen. Please enter your name, title, and city when you ask questions, and for verbal questions, you can raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon. Okay, just a couple of reminders regarding these draft advocacy recommendations. The first is that federal law generally preempts state and local regulation on rail traffic. The two notable exceptions have been setback requirements from rail lines, and under current law, states may adopt more stringent standards than federal law requires if three criteria are satisfied. There cannot be an undue burden on interstate commerce. The state standard must be compatible with federal standards, and it must be necessary to reduce or eliminate local safety hazards. Federal courts in any related litigation have been pretty conservative about very strict in applying this three-pronged test, and so relatively few local safety hazard type regulations have been upheld once challenged thus far. Again, just to continue the reminders, these are draft recommendations. They're subject to further discussion and final approval. Your input, of course, is welcome. Given the limitations that are imposed by federal preemption, these draft recommendations focus on potential points of advocacy for local governments in contacting federal agencies and their respective federal elected officials, primarily because the feds control the regulatory process in this area. An example of the dynamic is that one of the state's very recent legislative responses, SB 861 from earlier this year. That was a budget bill, but it had some regulatory provisions in it regarding the railroad. That has already been challenged in court due to a provision requiring railroads to develop an oil spill contingency plan that must be approved by the State Office of Oil Spill Prevention and Response. That's a little precedent setting because normally the railroads do not have to comply with state regulations traditionally because of federal preemption. So the issue raised in that suit is whether that regulation is preempted by federal law. And just a little housekeeping note, these are the entities to whom any advocacy effort should be addressed. There's the Federal Railroad Administration, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, both in Washington, D.C. There are also your federal elected officials, your senator or your member of Congress. We'll come back to this slide at the end for those who want a chance to copy down that information. So on with our draft advocacy recommendations. The first is to mandate electronically controlled braking systems. At the end of each one of these recommendations, we cite which state agencies have advocated for this change. What we did is we went through a number of the state agency documents on this issue, and we tried to find common threads where there was a maximum of consensus. So that sort of formed the universe of what these recommendations would look like. On the electronically controlled braking systems, This would require installation of electronically controlled pneumatic braking systems because they are more effective at braking trains faster and bringing the train to a full stop more quickly, more efficiently. And the recommendation is to install these systems on trains transporting Bakken crude and ethanol, specifically unit trains by a date certain. Unit trains are trains of, I believe, 100 cars or more. That is the threshold. This recommendation was brought forward by the Public Utilities Commission. Second is to expedite retrofit or phase out of tank cars failing to meet current safety standards. And this would require the current cars are called DOT 11. That's a Department of Transportation designation. But these tank cars that were manufactured prior to October 2011 may not be state-of-the-art. The Association of American Railroads adopted a higher set of manufacturing standards requiring greater structural integrity for these tank cars to facilitate safer transport of flammable liquids, including ethanol and all crude oil. That would, of course, include Bakken crude oil. This recommendation has been made by the Public Utilities Commission, the Office of Emergency Services, and the California Interagency Rail Safety Working Group. The Association of American Railroads has advocated that the Pipeline Hazardous Materials and Safety Administration adopt the higher standard. That decision is still pending, so that would be a potentially fruitful source of advocacy, a point of advocacy, rather. Third is to mandate provision of real-time information to first responders in the event of accidents. Now, this is different from what recent legislation, I believe AB 380 in California requires, which is to provide commodity flow data for the previous 3 months. That's a snapshot in time of past rail traffic. In talking to first responders, what they've said they need the most and what they will get the most use out of, what is most practical for them, is to have producers of petroleum and other hazardous materials, so either the railroads or the oil companies or the chemical companies that are producing hazardous materials, to make available to first responders only via a secure access portal on their websites the cargo manifest information, or in the industry what is called the consist, on trains that contain these substances. This means that in the event of an accident, first responders can, via the web, get onto the internet and find out what's on that train, what are the boiling points, what are the flash points, et cetera, what all the data they need to contain the accident and to secure the area. Because in the event of a major accident, that information, which is often available on the train in the engine car, in the event of a major accident where the engine car is damaged or destroyed, that information may not be available on the train itself. Ideally, this information should also be accessible via a mobile application, allowing first responders to access that information from the scene. This is a recommendation that has been put forth by both first responders and the National League of Cities. It also appeared on the California Interagency Rail Safety Working Group report. Fourth is additional federal funding for first responders. The California Interagency Working Group report highlighted the fact that in some areas our first responders are not appropriately trained and don't have proper equipment to respond to hazardous materials accidents. So this would direct federal funding to address that. That's been recommended by the Office of Emergency Services, first responders, and that Rail Safety Working Group. Fifth is mandatory speed limits, and this would ask the federal government, whether it's the Federal Railroad Administration or another entity, to impose mandatory minimum speed limits in all areas. That is an issue that the League highlighted in its comment letter in late September, but we should be aware, full disclosure, if the feds make that change, it will trigger delays in passenger rail transit times, since freight always has first priority. So just something to be aware of. Sixth, stricter reporting requirements. And this is a recommendation that came from the Office of Emergency Services to lower the threshold for the number of tank cars in a in a train that trigger a reporting requirement to the relevant state agencies, the California Energy Commission and the State Emergency Response Commission. The current standard is 33 cars. They'd like to lower that to 20 cars. Currently, the petroleum producers and railroads only have to submit that information if they're carrying, for example, Bakken crude oil of 33 or more cars. Now, that is equivalent to 34,500 gallons. That's an awful lot of crude oil. The OES recommendation would lower that trigger for the reporting requirement to 690,000 gallons or more. Seventh is to identify priority routes for positive train control. Now, positive train control is an advanced technology using GPS to automatically stop or slow trains before an accident can occur. It's been very effective. It is specifically designed to prevent train-on-train collisions, derailments that are due to excessive speed, and any unauthorized movement of trains. That's been recommended by the Public Utilities Commission, Senator Dianne Feinstein, as well as the Interagency Rail Safety Working Group. At the staff level, we are recommending that the change be, that the language be amended to provide an express federal requirement that the PTC be employed on all rail lines used for transport of Bakken crude oil, and the technology come online by a date certain. A number of these recommendations do not have hard deadlines, which is something that ought to be addressed in any advocacy efforts. 8 is to mandate railroad industry compliance with an individual voluntary agreement that was negotiated early this year between the railroads and the U.S. Department of Transportation. So there's already voluntary compliance going on, but a number of advocates have seized on the recommendation of the California Interagency Rail Working Group to make this just a hard and fast requirement. And some of these are addressed elsewhere in the recommendations, but they involve reduced speed for the trains, analysis to determine safest routes, increased track inspections, which obviously may trigger a need for more federal funding because the inspector force could always stand to be beefed up, enhanced braking systems, which is something we highlighted at the beginning of the webinar, installation of wayside defective bearing indicators along tracks, better emergency response plans, improved training, and working with communities through which oil trains must move to address community concerns. And I believe certainly on this last point, the railroads are already making headway on that last one. And that is it for the draft advocacy recommendations. We're going to be again submitting this to the League's relevant policy committees in January, and they may or may not become formal recommendations after that point. We welcome your input either today or in future via email, letters, what have you. But this is the universe of recommendations that look like will do the most to address rail safety in the shortest possible time. And now let's open it up for questions. So again, on the questions, you can either, we have unmuted the phone lines, you can either type them in or ask them. You've got open audio, everyone's phone line should be open. We'll give it a few minutes here. Also, as the League develops further information on this, we will be sharing that with our members. Certainly those who have registered for webinars will be included in that universe of information that goes out.
Okay, the first question is, was there anything in the recommendations addressing idling trains in residential areas? No, we have not focused on that. There was, in at least one of the state agencies, their formal recommendations did include not necessarily just the issue of idling trains in residential areas, but regulations pertaining to storing cars or parking them for a period of time on railroad sidings near terminals, whether it's at a rail terminal at a port or a refinery or what have you. That's another safety issue. We haven't included that because it didn't seem, not that it's not important, because it is, but it didn't seem other agencies hadn't picked that up. They often are not near the most populated areas. We haven't emphasized that, but certainly cities that are concerned about that, and because that is an issue in cities, for example, with ports, Oakland and Long Beach, for example, or cities that have railroad sidings near or outside refineries, that's definitely a point of advocacy in terms of having improved recommendations on what are the safety measures that are taken to ensure that there are no accidents or rail cars stored at those locations. Next question is, with regard to strict reporting requirements, why 20 instead of 32 tank cars? Why not require all tank cars? That is an excellent question. We expected that a number of our members would want reporting required for any shipments of any cars, even one. But the Office of Emergency Services has determined that 20 seems like a reasonable number to them. Obviously, individual cities are going to be free to advocate for stricter reporting requirements. These are just, we're sharing with you what the recommendations are that other state agencies are recommending. We thought that initially maybe a lower amount would be appropriate, but we thought also for the time being to stick with the OES recommendation. We will be investigating with them why that number, and perhaps it's appropriate to have a lower number, maybe 10 cars. But certainly any rail shipments through the community are going to potentially be a cause of concern if they contain Bakken crude oil or other hazardous material. Does the city of Escalon has had this issue take place, had complaints from citizens, how to address these complaints? I wonder if the person who asked that question, I believe Michael Borges, could be a little more specific on the nature of the complaints. Because if it's just an issue of we don't want these cars rolling through our community, that may not be something that the feds are willing to entertain, honestly. But I need a little bit more specifics on the nature of the complaint. Okay, next question is, has there been any thought of expanding these recommendations to apply to all hazardous materials shipments and not just crude oil? The answer is yes. In some cases, we did reference that these requirements should go to hazardous materials in general because there are significantly more dangerous substances that routinely move by rail that just haven't received any press attention because there haven't been any accidents. For example, chlorine, ammonia, things of that nature. If there's a leak of a tank car containing chlorine in a populated area, that can be far more devastating than a crude oil spill or even a crude oil spill accompanied by an explosion and fire. And the reason is chlorine has been used in the past as a biological weapon. That's extremely dangerous. The fumes are very dangerous to human life. So yes, we have thought about expanding these recommendations to all hazardous materials. That is something that's under consideration, and we may be doing that. It'll certainly be a topic of discussion when it comes before our policy committees in January.
I try to.
You're live. We can hear you. What was the question?
Oh, good. The question, it was in regards to the city of Escalon, and I tried to provide some additional information. We've had those cars, the oil tankers, parked for up to 24 hours or more idling within residential areas because of the double track and the stack up of cars apparently ahead of it, and gotten the complaints in regards to that and the concerns voiced by our council as well as citizens. Thus, I didn't see anything in those recommended about idling in residential areas. And I understand what you were saying about ports, but.
Right. Well, idling, we were not aware of that. That's not something that any of the state reports or the recommendations or the letters that have gone in, none of them has addressed that issue. However, that is definitely, among other things, that's a serious air quality issue, not to mention perhaps the noise. So that would be an issue to pick up with, obviously, your federal officials, your local members of Congress, also, and your senator. Also, the Regional Air Quality Board might be able to exert some influence in that to the degree it's causing an air quality issue.
Well, that was one area I hadn't thought about. We tried addressing it with the Commission of Public Utilities. It started there, and they recommended sending a letter to the legal department of the BSNF, but those are additional areas to try.
Yeah, I would say pursue all avenues, because that's an issue that it may take some time and quite a bit of advocacy to affect meaningful change. So I would encourage you to pursue all those avenues as well as the ones I've suggested.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Go ahead. Pretty Park has chosen an 81-year-old male, unconscious, not breathing, possible cardiac or respiratory arrest.
Okay, well, as I said earlier, the league is going to continue to develop information. We're trying to get better information on, for example, what facilities in California these shipments are going to, what are the planned locations as well as the current locations in terms of destinations, and also the exact routes that will be used. Now, some of this, at some point, there's obviously a security issue. So there may be a limit to how much information we're able to get from state agencies, but to the degree we can get further useful information from them, we're definitely going to be sharing that with our members. There's another question here. Where would funding come from for the recommended measures? It would be a mix of state and federal funds. We would expect that the lion's share of this would come from the feds. That's certainly what we're going to be asking for. There are limited funds available. For example, in this year's budget, I believe there was $10 million that went to the funding of training and equipment purchases for first responders. There was a separate revenue stream of $10 million that went to the Office of Oil Spill Prevention and Response for environmental cleanup, and as well as the expansion of their authority, because prior to 2014, OSPR, Oil Spill Prevention and Response, only had responsibility for coastal areas, because for the most part, oil was coming in by sea. But since we now have much more crude oil moving into California by rail, primarily from North Dakota, there's a need to expand the scope of their authority, the geographic scope of their authority. Okay, I would like to see if anyone has any comments. We want to ask what types of advocacy local governments have been pursuing, with whom and what they've been urging. Has anyone got any input on that? And again, the state funding, the Department of Finance has indicated it's going to be working to finding an ongoing revenue stream for the proactive purpose of training first responders, providing equipment for them. Some things such as foam trucks that can help in putting out fires have been and will be provided on a voluntary basis by railroads. They're not going to be able to do all of it, however. And the thought is, as far as the Office of Emergency Services is concerned, is to have, obviously you can't have foam trucks up and down the state, but to position them in strategic locations, and they are, since they are mobile, they have the ability to move them on an as-needed basis in the event of accident. But a great deal of funding ideally would come from the federal government. Okay, well, if no one has any comments on advocacy efforts, again, we are committed to developing better information. We'll be following up with you all regarding what the League's final recommendations are. We're going to be continuing to develop the best possible information on where Bakken crude is going. And we found out that the best source for that information, it may be the California Energy Commission, so we're going to be having discussions with that agency specifically because they may have more accurate information, for example, than Office of Emergency Services or any other state entity. Those discussions are pending. We will see. We have another question. Many cities have FRA, I guess that's Federal Railroad Administration, approved quiet zones. As more trains pass through, more train horn noise is expected. Is it possible for the feds to make the railroads install horn technology that limits the noise to the immediate area inside of a 2-mile radius? That is possible. I think it's an advocacy issue that locals should take up to the degree that they are concerned about it in their areas. Every city is going to be different in terms of what its top priorities are. Noise is certainly an issue in communities where you have residential areas that are in close proximity to tracks. I know in a number of jurisdictions in the Central Valley, for example, that may be the case. And so certainly that's an issue. And it may come up again in discussions with our policy committees. But that is an issue, frankly, that is, it's an ongoing issue. It has always been a problem with railroads. It may be more of a problem now that there are more frequent trains coming through containing crude oil, but that's an ongoing issue that is not directly related to the problem of oil by rail. That's just a generic railroad problem, and I do not at all mean to minimize it, but that's it's an advocacy point that certain communities are going to have to decide the degree to which they want to prioritize that. But it continues to be an issue, and I think to the degree that the railroads continue to hear about it, they will be more devote more time and energy to crafting some kind of perhaps voluntary regulation. But again, to the degree it's a problem, the more these agencies and federal electeds hear about it, there will be more attention on it. There's also a recommendation from the National League of Cities on this issue that the railroads should be subject to light pollution and noise constraints. Light pollution meaning the shining of lights at night is legally a form of nuisance. So that can be an issue that can be of great disturbance to residential areas at night. The National League of Cities has taken the position that there is a need for uniformity among the different federal agencies in their policies governing acceptable noise levels. So that is something that can be seized upon. You can take that to both your federal elected officials as well as the Federal Railroad Administration and the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Administration, to have them give that issue more attention, because the National League of Cities has adopted policy on that. We believe Brittany may have a question. Is that Brittany Lopez?
Hi, yeah, I'm with the city of Pittsburgh in the Bay Area, and
okay.
I had a question. I know that there are a number of cities, mostly in West County, that have adopted resolutions where they are basically saying that they don't want any rail cars going through their town that's carrying crude oil.
Right.
And I'm wondering if these recommendations move forward and are ultimately, you know, adopted or implemented by, you know, the Federal Railroad Administration or whoever, is there going to be any outreach to these cities to, you know, address this issue? Because they basically are stating that they don't want it going through their town no matter what.
Well, we're going to be keeping all our members informed. If you've registered for this webinar, we've got your information. We'll be following up with you. The difficulty with a sort of a zero tolerance policy that cities choose to adopt in the form of a resolution with regard to crude oil trains or Bakken crude oil trains is this: if you're in proximity to a railroad and it goes through your jurisdiction and you decided, your city council has decided, we don't want these things moving through our community at all, that triggers, assuming the feds are going to be willing to entertain that, which is assuming a lot, it's going to trigger a need for the trains to be rerouted. That is something that may interfere with interstate commerce. It may violate the federal preemption, which basically stands for the concept that the feds alone are going to decide where these trains go and what routes they use. It is something you may want to have that discussion with your federal elected officials, but the short answer is federal preemption is probably going to preclude that kind of a policy recommendation from being adopted by the relevant federal agencies. The other issue is, and this is a huge one, is that it may potentially interfere with interstate commerce if these trains have got to move through and maybe the next available rail line is 50 miles away, which is going to cause significant delays. The feds may very well take the viewpoint that's an undue burden on interstate commerce, and we're not going to allow that. That's the difficulty here. And there is a long history of federal statutory and case law that backs up the concept of federal preemption in this area. That's just, unfortunately, that's the reality. I wish I had better news for you on that, because I do understand the angst that this is causing in a lot of communities.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Okay, well, we'll give it a couple of more minutes. If there are any further questions, certainly willing to field them. If you think of questions or concerns that you have after today's webinar, feel free to contact the League. I'm Tim Cromartie. I'm the lead on this issue. If it's more of a transportation-related issue, I can send that to the relevant policy person or lobbyist. We're glad to field any questions, but our primary goal is to make sure our members are well informed about this issue, that they know what the major points of advocacy should be, what's likely to actually affect some positive change as far as advocacy to federal agencies, and exactly where to go, who to talk to get some action on these issues. Okay, well, again, if we don't have any further questions, I want to thank everyone for their attention, their interest in this issue. Again, the League is committed to developing the best possible information, which we will share with our members as we develop formal policy recommendations. We will definitely be putting that information out to members as well. All right, thank you all very much, and feel free to contact us if there are additional questions or concerns.